everyone, today I have really awesome news for you. It's really good. But before I explain the good news, I have to explain the background. And the background is bad. It's very sad. You see, there's this really serious, deadly genetic disorder that leads to a condition called Huntington's disease. But the good news is that scientists think they may have found a very promising treatment for it. So first, some background. There's a gene called HTT, or Huntington gene, which codes for a protein called Huntington. There's a section of nucleotide bases within this gene called a trinucleotide repeat. It's 3 base segments composed of cytosine, adenine, and guanine, which can be called CAG, or CAG for short. The CAG segment codes for an amino acid called glutamine. In the case of a mutation during cellular division, this CAG sequence, this trinucleotide repeat, can get copied again and again. It repeats, literally. So when this segment of DNA is replicated, there's numerous repeating CAG segments. So when this segment of DNA gets expressed and there's numerous repeating CAG segments, this will cause the resulting Huntington proteins that get produced to have an increasingly long chain of glutamine hanging off the end of it, and this is called a polyglutamine tract. So we all have this HTT gene that produces Huntington, and we all have a different number of these repeating CAG sequences. If you have, for example, fewer than 26 of these repeating CAG sequences, you won't develop Huntington's disease. It's not a risk for you. However, if you have more than this, problems can start to appear. If you have 27 to 35 copies of the CAG sequence in your Huntington gene, you personally won't develop the disease, but because it's heritable, your children have a greatly increased risk. If you have 36 to 39 copies of the CAG sequences, there's a good chance that you're going to be affected and that you might develop Huntington's disease. If you have 40 or more copies, you will develop Huntington's, and if nothing else kills you, then Huntington's will. In these last 2 cases, your children will each have a 50% chance of developing Huntington's, assuming that your partner has a healthy amount of these CAG sequences. The large number of CAG copies leads to a long polyglutamine tract, which creates a mutated Huntington protein. Because the protein is critical for brain development, a mutation or a functional defect is a fatal problem. The mutated protein accumulates in the tissues and in the cells, where it accelerates the rate of neuron decay and disrupts cell signaling mechanisms. They interfere with chaperone proteins that help properly fold other proteins, and this leads to the increased production of just generally misfolded proteins and all of the associated consequences of that. The high concentration of glutamate overstimulates and damages or kills neural cells, and this leads to bigger picture problems, like decay of the basal ganglia and the subsequent degradation in the capacity for deliberate movements and behavioral control. This is what directly leads to the jerking motions and the growing inability to speak or swallow food that comes with the onset of Huntington's disease. Some other symptoms associated with the terminal decline of Huntington's are similar to Parkinson's disease, and they include the development of dementia and eventually death. Symptoms typically appear in middle age, in the late 30s and the early 40s. Individuals born with a high number of CAG sequences can experience extremely strong symptoms as early as their 20s, which is rapidly fatal. Those with fewer CAG sequences will experience slower, less aggressive symptoms, but ultimately it always leads to death within 20 years of symptoms starting to appear. Because it's genetic, it's a condition that affects entire families. And because the problem of replicating CAG sequences is compounded with every generation, the youngest generations of offspring tend to have the most aggressive cases with the earliest onset. It's a brutal, unforgiving genetic disease, and until now, there's been little to no effective treatment. Okay, so this is where the good news comes in. Scientists in London devised a drug designed to intercept the mRNA molecules involved in the expression of the Huntington protein, and thus prevent it from being translated into an amino acid sequence that then folds into a mutated protein. After creating the drug, they conducted their first human trials on 46 patients at the Leonard Wolfson Experimental Neurology Centre in the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in London. The drug is injected into the cerebrospinal fluid, into the fluid that surrounds, lubricates, and protects your brain and the spinal cord inside your vertebral column. Once the drug is in the cerebrospinal fluid, it gets absorbed into the brain cells, where it blocks the mRNA. The results of the trial were really good. They showed a slowed progression of Huntington's, and in some patients, a moderate recovery of neurological function. Scientists are describing this not as a cure, but as a groundbreaking treatment that can offer hope to those families suffering from the genetic disorder. Professor Giovanna Malucci is an Associate Director of UK Dementia Research Institute at the University of Cambridge, and she called the treatment, quote, a tremendous step forward. Professor John Hardy, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on Alzheimer's, said, quote, I really think this is, potentially, the biggest breakthrough in neurodegenerative disease in the past 50 years, unquote. Professor Sarah Tabrizi, the lead researcher and director of the Huntington's Disease Center at UCL, said, and I quote, for the first time, we have the potential, we have the hope of a therapy that one day may slow or prevent Huntington's disease. This is of groundbreaking importance for patients and families.